How to teach speaking. When teaching speaking, there are three important factors to take into account. The first one is what speakers do. The second one is what speakers know. And the third one is speaking in another language. So, for the first one, which is what speakers do, we have some sub-elements that will help us understand in a better way. These are speech production. Sometimes we forget how hard it was to learn how to speak, because it is such a natural ability. However, the best way of remembering is when we start to learn another language. Here is when we realize that speech production is essentially linear, since it takes place in real time. Also, another factor worth highlighting is that speaking has a utterance by utterance form, and this accounts for its spontaneity. However, we can't say that speech is unplanned, but rather that it has a very limited time for planning. Another sub-element is conceptualization and formulation. Here, it is important to pinpoint the word conceptualization. One conceptualizes a discourse following a sort of pattern. First, it is necessary to determine the type of discourse, then its topic, and finally, its purpose. However, before this process occurs, the idea that you want to express must be mapped out or formulated. To formulate an idea, it is necessary to make strategic choices in the discourse, syntax, and of course, vocabulary. In English, utterances are usually a two-part structure. The first one being known as the topic, which is basically what we are talking about, and the second one, the comment, that is what we want to say about a specific topic. One way for speakers to compensate the short time for planning is something that is known as add-on strategy. This strategy focuses on chaining together short phrases and clauses-like chunks that will accumulate to form a turn. This strategy is part of a bigger concept called grammaring, that in simple words, it's the amount of information held in our working memory. However, each word we choose to express ourselves is determined by an assessment of how appropriate the word is for a particular context. In addition, in this formulating stage, it is important for words to be assigned their pronunciation. This includes a proper use of stress and a meaningful use of intonation in order to express clear ideas. The next sub-element is articulation. For this, organs of speech are necessary to produce sounds, accompanied by a stream of air in a specific position or movement from the tongue or lips, as in the case when pronouncing vowel sounds. On the other hand, consonant sounds are determined by the point in which an air obstruction occurs. For English speakers, it is possible, taking into account the different variables, to produce over 40 different phonemes. Also, it is important to bear in mind that in fluent speech, some words sometimes merge with others or simply disappear, as in the case of handbag, that would sound like handbag. To conclude this sub-element, we must be aware that some continual changes like loudness, pitch, direction, tempo, and pausing serve to organize the sounds into meaningful word forms, and then the words into meaningful utterances. The following sub-element is self-monitoring and repair, which is basically rethinking of whatever you are saying. This can occur concurrently with the formulating and articulation stage. For instance, if you're talking about someone and suddenly you realize that that person may be listening to you, you will probably slow down or even pause to change your utterances. This would be self-monitoring at the formulating stage. For the self-monitoring of the articulation stage, it can be seen when speakers correct themselves after mispronouncing a word. Closely related to monitoring is the ability to make what is known as running repairs, which means that the speakers correct themselves immediately, as in Kathy's teacher, or retrace and repair, which is basically rewinding an idea and saying it all over again. Another sub-element is automaticity, which allows speakers to focus their attention on the aspects of the speaking task that immediately requires it, whether it is planning or articulation. In the stage of formulating, the automaticity is partly achieved through the use of prefabricated chunks. At the discourse level, whole segments may have been memorized from previous tellings. Then we have fluency. In fluency, speed is a factor that plays an important role. However, it does not make a speaker fluent or not. Research has shown that pausing is a skill that proficient speakers have. It is necessary to stop from time to time to allow the formulation of an utterance to catch up with its conceptualization. However, frequent pauses is a sure sign of a struggling speaker. It is important to know when to do the appropriate pauses, so it can sound like natural pauses. They often occur at the intersection of a clause or after a group of words that form a meaningful unit. Another significant factor in the perception of fluency is the length of run. For instance, the number of syllables between pauses. The longer the runs, the more fluent the speaker sounds. And the last sub-element is managing talk. Here, interaction is the main concept. Speakers most of the time have face-to-face dialogue, and this involves interaction from each part. From managing talk appears the term of turn-taking. This is basically that two speakers should not be talking at the same time. Instead, each one should take turns to speak. Following the same vein of ideas, the concept of paralinguistic comes to float. This concept refers to all those other ways of turn-taking that does not involve talking, but that the speakers take it as a sign to speak. For instance, raising shoulders, head nods, among others.
Now let's see what speakers know. Firstly, we have extralinguistic knowledge, in which context knowledge allows speakers to make reference to the immediate context. And there are some kinds of extralinguistic knowledge that affect speaking. Those are topic and cultural knowledge, knowledge of the context, and familiarity with the other speakers. Also, sociocultural knowledge is the knowledge about social values and the norms of behavior in a given society. Secondly, we have linguistic knowledge, and there are two main purposes for speaking. The first one is transactional, for which its primary purpose is to convey information and facilitate the exchange of goods or services, and the second is interpersonal, for which its primary purpose is to establish and maintain social relations. Here we have some examples. We have the purpose of the discourse, if there is participation or not, and if it is planned or not. In an airport announcement, this is transactional, non-interactive, and planned. In a sports commentary, this is transactional, non-interactive, and unplanned. And the same with the other examples. In third place, we have discourse knowledge. And it is about knowing how to organize and connect individual utterances, as well as how to map this knowledge onto the turn-taking structures of interactive talk. Then, there is pragmatic knowledge. It describes the relation between language and its context of use, including the purposes for which language has been used. Then we have grammar in spoken language. It is more common to find taught questions, direct speech, the use of vague language, and ellipses. With respect to vocabulary, the 50 most frequent words in spoken English make up nearly 50% of all talk. And here we have dialectic language in speech, and it is spatial deixis, temporal deixis, and person deixis. In spatial, we have here in this. Those indicate place and thing. We have also temporal deixis. Those indicate time as now and this, and person deixis, it talks about the person like I and me. It is said that speakers achieve fluency through the use of prefabricated chunks. But what are chunks? Chunks are sequences of speech that not assembled word by word, but have been pre-assembled through repeated use and are now retrievable and single units. We have collocations, phrasal verbs, idioms, sentence frames, social formulas, and discourse markers. Another part of speech is phonology, and it means intonation and paratone. In intonation, it serves to separate the stream of speech into blocks of information and to mark information within the units as being significant. In paratone, it is the use of intonation to mark the beginning of a new stage in the discourse. Finally, we have speech conditions, and these are made of cognitive factors, affective factors, and performance factors. Cognitive factors are about familiarity with the topic, the genre, and the interlocutors. Affective factors are about feelings towards the topic and the participants. And performance factors are the mode, degree of collaboration, discourse control, planning and rehearsal time, time pressure, and environmental conditions. The last part is about speaking in another language. But first, we have to differentiate between L1 and L2 speaking. With respect to the stages of the mental processing, there is not much difference at all. But second language speakers' knowledge of the second language, including its vocabulary and grammar, is rarely as extensive as their knowledge on their first language. And here we have three main theories of language learning that are relevant to the teaching of speaking. The first one is behaviorist theory, and it is about the formation of good language habits through repeated reinforcement, and the stages are presentation through modeling, practice, and production. The second one is cognitivist theory, and they say that learning of speaking is like a move from controlled to automatic processing, and they have a progress from awareness raising, proceduralization, restructuring, to automaticity or autonomy. Then we have sociocultural theory, and they say that speaking is a social phenomenon. Therefore, it requires activity and interactivity. And the stages are other regulation, appropriation, and self-regulation.
That's all, folks.